This is a very important night for me. I actually got started in all of this. Marion Rose is here, and so is Deborah Goldberg. I chair the Hydraulic Fracturing Committee for the League of Women Voters of New York State. My name is Elizabeth Radow. I'm also the president of the League of Women Voters of Larchmont and Mamaroneck. For people not living in the area, I've been very involved in conservation outside of my work life for a decade, mostly water. We live right on the Long Island Sound, and water is an issue that obviously doesn't only impact us here, it impacts us everywhere. And that's what we're here for tonight, really, is the water, among other things. But a few years ago, Nina Cuddy, who was then the president of the League of Women Voters of Larchmont and Mamaroneck, came back from the convention from Albany for the League and said, I just listened to a woman named Deborah Goldberg, who was the managing attorney of Earth Justice, speak about something called hydraulic fracturing in upstate. Would you do a program on it? And I have friends that live in Pennsylvania with a weekend house just over the border, and they had been talking about it, but I really wasn't all that pulled into it. I didn't connect the dots. Deborah came to speak, Marion came to speak, and I knew immediately that this was, and Al, I wonder if you agree with me, I think this is the biggest environmental issue in this state, in this country, probably in my lifetime.
Yeah.
It certainly is now.
It is, and it unfolds. And then the question is, well, why does it matter to us here? Isn't that going on upstate, and why don't we care? And don't we have this protected filtered water system? Al's going to tell us a little bit about that. Unfiltered, correct. Thank you for correcting me. Right now, we are in the middle of a comment period for an environmental impact statement that's going to end on December 12th. And the League is committed to giving public education forums. Just want to clarify something. The League is not committed to giving both sides of a story. That is not something we have to do. We've been looking at this issue now for a period of years. We haven't been able to come out with a position because that requires an in-depth study. There's a whole protocol for it. There has to be board approval, etc. But the League does have positions that are decades old that stand on preservation of our natural resources, that stand on commitment to lower the carbon emissions in this country. And we in the state are committed to only approving this if it can be done safely. And we see at this point this cannot be done safely. So that really is where the League stands. I wouldn't call it a position in quotes, but if people want to walk out of here understanding after very in-depth study, at this point with the S-guys where we are, and we haven't seen the regs, but at this point we don't see that it can be done safely. And based on my research, which I've been doing on an ongoing basis, neither can it be done at the expense of the gas company. And as far as we're concerned, this is an operation that needs to be done on the nickel of the gas company, and not on the nickel of the homeowner, and certainly not on the nickel of the taxpayer. For those of you who may not have had an opportunity to really see what this is about, we're not going to show Gasland. It's a long movie. In fact, a year ago, we showed the movie with Susanna Glidden, who's here, and Marion Rose up at the Jacob Burns Film Center. So this is really our anniversary, and certainly there's been a lot of water under the bridge since then. We're going to show an extended trailer from Gasland, so you can get an idea.
I was right.
I don't think you need the sound. I think people get it.
Yeah.
One of the points that the film makes very well is that the reason we don't read and hear about these people more is because the gas companies settle with them and ask them to sign non-disclosure agreements. So we've got people in this country who are living in homes where there's methane gas and other risks on a daily basis, and they are signing non-disclosure agreements. They live in fear, and they can't speak to their neighbors, which is un-American at the very least. And this is not just something that's happening in Garfield, it's happening in the various states where this is going on. And there are 34 states with underground shale. Now, I don't know that we're going to be fracking in all of them all at the same time, but this is a nationwide issue, so that anything we're saying tonight with respect to New York is, except perhaps with respect to the unfiltered water, and Al may know how many unfiltered water systems there are in the country, but with respect to the pollution, this is a nationwide issue. One thing I want to say before I introduce Al is there are a number of people here from citizen groups who have been working tirelessly throughout the year. I'm on the internet every night when I come home from work. I've got friends in upstate New York who have shared things with me. I have shared things with them. This is a remarkable testament to America. The people that are involved in this, I want to put it, I don't want to call it movement, I don't want to call it citizen action. This is loyalty to this country and love for one another. And there are going to be people upstate who are going to be watching downstate, and I want the people upstate to know that we've got a filled room because we're as concerned about you as we are about ourselves. And the reason that we're able to have this kind of showing is because of the internet. There are listservs, and anybody that is interested in this, all you have to do is type in Marcellus Shale. We've got lists outside. At the end of the evening tonight, we're going to ask you to write letters. The only way we're going to make change in this country that suits us is if we actually all exercise our voices. Otherwise, I'm just standing up here educating you, which maybe isn't such a bad thing, but it doesn't get us really where we need to be. So I'm asking you in return, aside from maybe joining the League of Women Voters, to please write letters, because it really is very important. There is a hearing in Albany on Thursday. It's an assembly hearing. People are welcome. It's an open hearing. I was talking to Barbara Lifton today. She said they stay there till people are done. Al's going to be at the Cornell Club on Thursday. And there's another public hearing on November 30th at the Tribeca Performing Arts Center. Is that where that is? And I believe that I'm going to be testifying on behalf of the League of Women Voters. I think I've got, though, to get an invitation for that. It's different than the assembly hearing. So we'll see how that works. I think I'll wear my red boots and see if that works. And again, there's material outside. There is this so-called SGIS, which is the redraft of the Supplemental Generic Environmental Impact Statement. This isn't the whole thing. Okay, this is bedtime reading. And no one's asking everybody to read all this, but this is what we're supposed to be commenting on in, what, 90 days, now 120 days? No. This is a lot, and this isn't everything. This was through July. There are websites, though, that can help synopsize, and we can help you with that. There are a couple of very reputable groups that are looking at trying to pinpoint where the flaws are, and again, you can go in and look at that and write letters. I see Tony Luisi in the audience. Tony and I work together, and I want to thank you, Tony, publicly, because you've been invaluable to me in my research.
Thank you.
That's great. All right. Yeah. I think many, if not most, all people in this room know the name Al Appleton. Al is the former commissioner of the Department of Environmental Preservation in New York City, and he is responsible for the drinking water that we have. His achievements and accolades are really so remarkable. He's now an international environmental consultant, and I'm going to read his words because I don't want to do an injustice to them. With interlocking expertise in water resource and water utility management, watershed protection, infrastructure, economics and public finance, land use and regional landscape preservation, sustainable development, and the use of market strategies such as payment for ecosystem services to achieve mutually supporting economic development and environmental protection goals. When I'm in touch with Al, he's going to Montana, he's been to, is it New Zealand? Australia. Al is sought after all over the world, and so I feel particularly privilege that Al is here today. I met Al through my conservation partner, Marshall Case. Marshall built the education system for Audubon nationwide, and Al established the first New York City Audubon chapter. Is that right?
I enrolled in.
And Marshall has said to me that, before he introduced me to Al, this man is of the best and the brightest, and coming from him, I knew that that was quite a compliment.
All right, gas fracking. I got involved in this issue because some people appealed to me about my love of the New York City watershed and the people who drink its water. But like most issues, I think they're best addressed from a holistic perspective. So over the last 3 years, I've gone to just advising people about the narrow pollution issues and political organizing, to the much broader context in which we find ourselves facing this issue. And so I want to go from the general, from the specific, starting where Beth has taken me, to the general. But before I start, I want to compliment the League of Women Voters, because in the debate that has often been illustrated by more heat than light, the League is really brilliantly performing its historic role of educating, of nagging, of making people pay attention, and bringing these issues to a point where intelligent people can make intelligent decisions about them. And in the face of what is a multi-million-dollar barrage of public relations by the shale gas industry, because I'm going to specifically call it shale gas, because traditional natural gas was actually a pretty good fuel. And one of the problems in this debate is that shale gas is trying to ride its back, on the historic reputation of natural gas. Now, I want to spend 2 minutes talking about the shale process, because even people who have been in this debate for a couple of years often don't understand. 1 to 2 miles below us, mostly across the world, are layers of shale. Shale is a compressed motion mud. And these shales are often older than multi-celled life. That is, the natural gas we're pulling out of shale is not even like oil from the great carbon fern explosion of 320 to 240 million years old. This natural gas is 500, 600, 700, 800 million years ago, when this rain of single-celled life was descending upon the muds of the ocean floor and gradually become trapped and metamorphized over time. Now, we've always known this natural gas was there, but in 2005, Halliburton adapted a technique that is old. The industry likes to say we've been doing fracking for 60 years. They have been doing fracking, but they haven't been doing this kind of fracking. They adapted an older and much simpler technique. Because you saw to drive down maybe 1.5 miles into the earth, and then in one of the wonders of modern engineering, turn the pipe horizontally and shoot it down 1/2 mile, a mile. Now they can go as far as 2 miles. Now, what they then do is as follows. The natural gas is locked in the shale. It's not motionless, but the coefficients of movement express themselves in geologic time epochs, 100,000 years, 1,000,000 years. So what they're essentially doing when they frack shale is they're trying to speed up the gas. So the way they do this is they drive sand into the shale at very high pressure. The sand creates and holds microscopic pores, and a certain amount of the gas from the shale flows into the horizontal borehole and comes out. Now, not all the gas in the shale flows. The gas often won't flow very long, a few years before they've exhausted it. They will often refrac, as they say, the same hole or slightly different hole. And so far, that process is not so bad. But here's what happens. If you ever put sand in water, what does it do? It sinks. It sinks to the surface, stays there, doesn't move. They have to have something that holds the sand in the water long enough for the sand to drive into the shale layers and do its thing. That means they need components that in physical terms have a specific gravity that is equal to sand, so it will hold the sand in solution. And it turns out that virtually all of the components that have this specific gravity happen to have very long and unpleasant names. There are a few we know, like diesel fuel, benzene, but you can custom design these chemicals to do even better. You can combine them with corrosion inhibitors. You can combine them with microbiological killers, because the microalgae can form slimes on these pipes, reducing the thing. So the reason we have this toxic concern is the sand. Without these toxic chemicals, you could not frack. And that's what makes this issue so different than traditional natural gas drilling. Because what traditional natural gas drilling did was one of two things. Either it collected the natural gas trapped in oil that we used to bring the oil up to the surface, or it collected the natural gas that had migrated through the shale into a dome-shaped container. And it was like just sticking a straw down into that container and pulling out all the natural gas. Unfortunately, that natural gas in the United States is pretty much exhausted. Natural gas was sinking fast as an industry until they discovered shale. So when people talk about natural gas, quote, clean burning natural gas, in the future they are talking about clean burning but not so clean extracting shale gas. All right. Now, these toxic chemicals, the industry likes to hint. They say several interesting things about these toxic chemicals. And you'll see them on some of the ads. I'm sure when the World Series comes along, we're going to be, subjected to every third inning or so one of these nice ads saying America's future is in natural gas. But let's just kind of talk about some of the more blatant pieces of propaganda. The industry, for example, likes to say that the toxic portion of fracking fluid is less than 1%. It's 99.5% water and sand. Well, that happens to be true. Unfortunately, diesel oil is toxic to the 3 parts in 1 million. Gasoline is toxic to the 1 part in 1 million. Some things that are really hyper are toxic to the parts per billion. So that if you only have 1/2 of 1% of these toxins in fracking fluid, you've got poison. Poison, sheer and simple. This is essentially an argument based on the ignorance of the people who hear it, that has a surface plausibility that is disastrously misleading. Another thing the industry likes to say is we are so far down that the stuff down here can never migrate. Well, there's some spurious truth to that. But first of all, the fact that they're so far down doesn't mean it can't migrate, because shale is not impervious. You see these little industry pictures with this straw going down and everything is nice and solid. Well, if you actually went down and looked at the sonograms of these geological areas, you'd see fissures that run up to 10 miles. And moreover, what the industry is going to be doing is once it fracks these pipes and takes them away, those are going to remain as new fractures. And it's not as if the gas isn't going to flow into those fractures, it's just the gas will no longer flow fast enough for the industry to harvest it. So, shale gas or methane, which is what natural gas really is, CH4, is down there and it's moving. And sooner or later it will move to a point where it may interact with human uses. It will probably not do that today, but 30 years from now, if your children begin to notice in certain rural areas, or maybe even here, that they too can light their drinking water, that's what has happened. Of course, unfortunately, for those of us who know the history of mining in the Northeast, the 80,000 empty drill holes in New York, the 8,000 abandoned mines in Pennsylvania that leach acid runoff, the industry may be long gone, but the consequences will remain behind. That's another myth that really has to be dealt with. The biggest myth, though, the two biggest myths, though, are as follows. Number one is America's energy security demands natural gas. Now, there's been a lot ever since OPEC in 1973, for those of us who unfortunately must admit to being old enough to remember all of that, that America really can't spend all of this money overseas buying oil from the Arabs, terrorists. All these little subplots that are used to scare people. Well, ideally we wouldn't. And there's a perfectly good way to stop that. It's called green energy. But we can come back to the minute. But the appeal to this American domestic natural gas. This is pure chauvinism that has not the slightest economic basis to it. If we were really worried about our balance of payments, we would do something about our balance of payments with China. Which dwarfs the kinds of payment exports we make in terms of oil. But if we were really, really worried, we'd go to green energy. But I hope we'll have 2 minutes of that towards the end. The other thing, though, is it goes back to this clean burning natural gas. This was true when with your, what do we like to say, your grandfather's natural gas. It is still clean burning, but if you add up all the environmental consequences, it's far different. Natural gas needs enormous amount of truck traffic to bring water, to bring chemicals, to move the workers. It needs enormous amount of pipeline construction. But the worst thing about natural gas is it vents and it leaks methane. And for those of you who've been forced into following the global warming issue, methane is 12 times as powerful a global warming gas as carbon dioxide. So that for every 12 atoms of CO2 we're saving by not burning coal instead of natural gas, every atom of methane wipes that out. There are now competent studies that suggest not only is there no real difference between natural gas and coal, and this is not an argument for coal, but there is no real difference between shale gas and coal. But in some instances, shale gas may actually be a worse global warming gas than continuing to burn coal with this stuff. So when I said about the League bringing some light and truth to this thing, I very badly meant it. Because what we have is an industry that has so far been refusing to face the fact that this is not an easy thing. This is not, as they like to say, there's no evidence at all of environmental impact. Au contraire. The problem the industry has is once they admitted there was an environmental impact, the whole thing would tumble. Because they'd have to totally change their way of doing business. It would cost them money, it would cost them time, it would cost them having to deal with all the problems Beth is going to talk about in a few minutes. The industry is in one of these positions that we often see in public life where people don't dare admit honestly that they have a problem because they would then have to change all sorts of things. And things that they don't want to change because frankly they would cost them money. Now, the debate on gas fracking starts with water. So let me tell you the story very briefly on water. Most of you know that 90% of Westchester, there's a long list of the water utilities there, gets its water from the New York City water system. And increasingly it's from the Cat Delaware system, not the Croton system, which thankfully is not threatened by any fracking activity, because fracking will end someplace west of the Hudson when the Marcellus peters out. But the Catskill system was terribly threatened by these kinds of frack activity. And we've been very lucky and then unlucky in that Governor Patterson was going to open the watershed to shale gas drilling. There was an enormous uproar about that. And the Cuomo administration looked like it had heard the message and was going to put the New York City watershed off limits. Before I tell you the loophole in that, let me tell you why all the other people in the state who are in watersheds are still upset. Fracking fluids spill. Fracking fluids naturally erupt in uncontrolled comings back to the surface. Half of fracking fluid has to come up anyway and they've got no place to put it. Fracking fluid is often stored in open pits, many of which in Hurricane Irene overflowed in Pennsylvania. So that there are 4 or 5 ways that these toxic chemicals that are used in fracking can get into surface water. And once they get into surface water, they do not biodegrade. There is no bacteria that eats them. So that essentially dilution is the only solution to their pollution. That was no more rhyming than a minute. But be that as it may, so that once this stuff begins to get into the water system, there's nothing you can do about it. If it gets in any kind of quantity, your water is going to be polluted. Now, we have seen this most of all in rural areas. Now, the rural areas, fortunately, are not municipal water supplies, they're mostly wells. So how are these wells being polluted if they're so down deep? They're being polluted because the casings are drilled. The drilling is sloppy. As any of you in this room who are civil engineers know, concrete work is tough. It has very high standards of quality. Moreover, if you're going down this deep, you have to grout the well, so as the earth shifts, it doesn't put differential stresses in the pipe and break it. At least 10% in Pennsylvania of the wells that have been drilled have failed almost immediately. And in those failed wells, that's how these materials are leaking into the water systems of rural people and creating the effects that Josh described so brilliantly in Gasland. But if they were to get into municipal water systems, the effect would be far more tragic. New York likes to talk about our unfiltered water, champagne of drinking waters, and it really is terrific water. I grew up in mountain water in the West in New York and Manchester, cup for cup. But if you're up in, say, Rochester or Buffalo or Binghamton or Elmira or Utica, your water has to be filtered. These filtration systems cannot deal with the material in fracking fluid. These filtration systems are designed to deal with microorganisms, like E. coli. They're designed to deal with pathogens like Giardia and Cryptosporidium. And they're designed to deal with sediment. They are not designed to deal with chemicals. Maybe the sand will catch some of the chemicals as it goes through, but if so, the sand becomes rapidly saturated and deteriorates the overall filtration. But you cannot guarantee the safety of a water system in the face of these chemicals with only standard filtration for municipal water systems. So those cities, just like New York City would be, it's not just that we would have to build a filtration plant to protect your water, we would have to build a hyper-filtration plant to protect your water, not only from the normal pollutants, but from all of the things that are in fracking fluid. And there are so many things in fracking fluid, it would be very hard to build a water system because it involves things like carbon stripping, thermal expansion, salt, evaporation and salt collection. That would reliably get these hundreds of fracking components out of your water system. So that if this pollution reaches your water system, or a water system of the people upstate, the state of New York taxpayers, i.e. you, are going to pay an enormous amount of extra money that will be a direct subsidy to shale gas fracking. And why we in New York and why we in Westchester, even though our water system may now be protected, have a vested interest in that is not only our second homes, not only our solidarity, but the fact of the matter is New York City and Westchester make enormous tax transfers to the rest of the state. And if the rest of the state becomes poorer, which is what gas fracking threatens to make it, then we are going to become poorer too, because we are going to have to help support those communities that can no longer support themselves. And some of the things Beth is going to describe are going to explain exactly what kind of economic juggernaut these places are facing. Now, I said the Cuomo administration took the watershed off the table for gas fracking. But what's the loophole? There are two loopholes, as a matter of fact. The first is they've only set a buffer zone of 4,000 feet around the watershed. Now, if you have underground laterals, as they're called in the industry, they can go 5,000 to 10,000 feet. Then you have the ability to go into under the watershed. There should be a buffer zone in these areas of at least 10,000 feet and maybe more. And that's before we get to the other kicker in this. But the real problem with the current regulations are they only have a 1,000-foot barrier around water infrastructure. That if you are an underground aqueduct which feeds down to Westchester, you can see them disappearing off the map there. If you're a pumping station, if you're a dam, you can have shale gas fracking within 1,000 feet of these areas. Now, even the Army Corps of Engineers, which I must say is getting better, but still has a few problems with being green, is now calling for a 3,000-foot buffer around its dams. The Hazen and Sawyer study called for a 7-mile buffer because we have documented in our construction history in the city that there are 7-mile long fissures in the shale around the aqueducts. In fact, when they built those aqueducts in the 1940s and 50s, they had huge problems with methane intrusions, with underground fires, with maintaining the integrity of the aqueduct system. So that the idea that there's only going to be a 1,000-foot buffer around this infrastructure is, on the basis of the geologic science, hopelessly inadequate. But we're not just talking now about middle and long-term pollution. We're talking about catastrophic failure. Let's say you have a lead that connects to one of these fissures and begins to build up methane against one of the aqueducts. To begin with, concrete is porous. You wouldn't know that unless you worked with the North River Sewage Treatment Plant and had to deal with the odors that were leaking through the concrete domes over the settling tanks, but concrete is porous to gas. How fast, how quickly, I don't have the stuff in front of me. It can also put pressure. Gas has only got one way to go and it runs into an aqueduct. It's going to start putting pressure on that aqueduct and we can't say what would happen. Under the worst scenarios, somebody could be mucking around, they could create a path for oxygen, they could create some kind of friction, there could be even be explosion. How likely are any of this? Not very. But if any of this happened, half of the water that comes into the New York City Westchester area would be out in 24 hours. And the question then becomes, for the few dozen natural gas wells that would be excluded if we go to a barrier of 7 miles, is risking this worth it? The Cuomo administration has very wisely decided to shut down Indian Point, largely because, while the risk is small, the catastrophe would be potentially immeasurable. But Indian Point at least provides us with some significant power. If we're willing to get rid of this power, why are we willing to risk our water for something that is trivial in comparison? So, in those letters Beth is going to talk to you about writing, it is in your interest as Westchester people, and not just to the governor but to your local leaders, to stress that a scientifically based barrier, scientifically based buffer zones of at least 10,000 feet around the watershed and at least 7 miles, preferably 10, around all of the city's water infrastructure are needed to guarantee the integrity of the safety. And it is difficult for me, as a public manager, who's had to understand politics because the alternative was, to understand why the governor, having done such the right thing in terms of protecting our watershed from drilling, is now being so cavalier about protecting the water infrastructure that is just as important. Now, I want to mention two other things quickly because Beth has got a lot we need to hear, and I know she wants to have some time for questions. Pollution is the first problem with shale gas fracking, but it's not the only problem. The second problem is what it does to the landscape itself. It industrializes the landscape. This not only undermines virtually every other economic activity, but it changes its hydrologic characteristics. Think of landscapes like the New York City watershed or like the Croton watershed, that are no longer wooded, meadowed, lightly populated, have now become areas in which there's large clearings, they're crossed with roads and pipelines. Tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of acres of trees have been cut down. These areas have been left, the industry claims it will restore all of these areas. It hasn't been done before. I'd be delighted if it happened now, but don't bet on it under the current regulatory structure. So the whole hydrological characteristic of all of these landscapes, not only ours, not only Syracuse's, but Rochester's and Buffalo's and Binghamton's and Elmira's and Utica's and the Finger Lakes, are going to be devastated. That is, the water dynamics across those landscapes are going to change, and they're going to change for the worse. And that will bring in all sorts of other pollution that will be just as bad for us, not to mention what it will do to the livelihoods and the way of life of the local residents. The last thing I want to mention, though, is we do not, all of the industry propaganda to the contrary, we don't need this gas. What we need is wind power, solar power, heat pump power, energy conservation, all sorts of interesting creativity. Tidal power is coming up very fast. We're going to spend as a country $500 billion to $1 trillion on developing shale gas. Why don't we spend that $500 billion to $1 trillion developing all of these power sources? They have none of the pollution consequences. They have none of the social consequences of gas fracking. Every time people tell me gas fracking means jobs, I want to say, but there are conventions against this thing. It will be great jobs for women in their 20s who like working on their backs. It will be great jobs for people who are interested in penology. It will be great jobs for people who are, mortgage brokers and bankruptcy foreclosures. It will be great jobs if you don't want to do organic farming anymore. If you want to see the wine industry leave New York for Virginia. The net cost in these landscapes will be far greater than natural gas will ever produce, even if we were to pass a severance tax. And one might really want to know why we were talking about doing any of this until we have a major severance tax on the industry in place. From my perspective, that I've gained over the years in dealing with these issues, I want to close on the word sustainability. Sustainability is not my favorite phrase, but everyone is familiar with it, so I'll give you what I think it means. It means that we understand that we can't have a world in which it's the environment against the economy. That we have to have a world in which the environment and economy work together and reinforce each other together. That the economy of the 21st century, whether it's green energy or green buildings or green jobs, is really going to be based on turning the environment into a profit center. It is wisely using the wealth of the environment that I believe is the key to our economic future. Shale gas fracking is understandable from the perspective of companies who don't want to go out of business. We've been in the fossil fuel business in the United States for the last 100 years, ever since Drake in 1859. It's been a great business. Fossil fuel made this world. In 1765, we would have all been in an unheated building with candle lights and soot-blackened walls. We would have come here across muddy roads and buckboards, and many of us would have to sleep in the buckboards overnight because it would have been too dark to go home. Fossil fuel changed all that world for us. It's not, you cannot damn too heartily the people who at this point want it, because we have such a history with it. It's hard to give up a success. But fossil fuel is no longer a success. The cost curve and the benefit curve for fossil fuel are crossed, and we now have alternatives to fossil fuel that will be far better for us. Institutionally, it's always tough to accept this kind of change. It's tough if you're Saudi Arabian to realize you're going to go back to being a hunk of unwanted sand in the middle of no place, but that's where we've got to go for the future. So that Shale gas fracking is about public health, it's about democracy, it's about accountability, it's all the things the League of Women Voters defends so well. But ultimately, it's about the past against the future. So we're not only protecting our drinking water, we're not only protecting our tax base, we're not only protecting ourselves and our public citizens. When we stand up to these kinds of, essentially self-preservation arguments for the shale gas fracking industry, we're really standing for the future. And whatever you can do for that future, the future will greatly appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, yeah. We're parents in this room, many of us, and if we're not parents, we have friends who have children. When Al talked about the future, it's not just about energy, it's about our children, it's about our flesh and blood, it's about the people that are going to take over our place when we're not here. After college, I went to law school in New York City, and after my real estate development, I then went to Weil Gotcha, where I was working on leveraged buyouts. I learned about financing on Wall Street. I understand it. I did it for years. I've also worked on large workouts for large real estate development companies. I understand repaying 55 cents on the dollar. I've negotiated those deals. A lot of this is about allocating risk. I'm a transactional attorney. I'm not a litigator. And what I do for a living is figure out who does what. I also do construction contracts, who's responsible for what, and who pays for it. Part of what lawyers do, and this is not in disrespect, we need lawyers in this country. We need moral people putting things together and making things happen. We allocate risk. And what I try to do when I put contracts together is do it in a conciliatory way and figure out, well, if I'm responsible for doing something, shouldn't I pay the cost, right? If your kid makes a mess, you tell your kid to clean it up. I mean, this is really very basic, and if I get a little bit too flighty, I hope someone will just raise their hand and say, could you please reorient? Because I've been living with this issue for quite a long time now, and if it gets to be a little bit too complicated, I will try to simplify. But one thing I think everyone's going to understand in this room is that oil and gas is investor driven. This is about making money for investors. Okay? This is not about the people who are living upstate who are allowing someone to come onto their property and extract the shale gas. And this is how, as I have this conversation with you, you just think about it in that fashion. So why are we rushing right now? What's the rush? Why can't we, I've heard Al say, this shale's been in the ground, this gas has been in the ground for millions of years. What's your hurry? What's the hurry? Investors are the hurry. The gas leases are about to expire. When the gas man came to upstate New York, before any of us knew what Marcellus Shale was, and they thought it was the grandfather's well in the corner, they gave him a lease, and I've read many of these leases. And as I mentioned before, I've got friends upstate. We've looked at these leases. These are very similar from company to company, and I won't say they're identical, but they're very close. And the material terms that I'm going to talk about, which do have relevance to us, are remarkably the same. So they came with this, you want to make some money? Okay, well, who doesn't want to make some money? And there's a speech, I didn't bring it with me, but there's something that goes around, somebody dropped, one of the landmen dropped one of his speeches on somebody's driveway. A friend of mine thinks that it's a Saturday Night Live skit, because in New York we're cynical enough to think it's a Saturday Night Live skit. It's not. Go for the men, they don't ask questions. Women are too inquisitive. Speak about China because they're going to be dominating the country. I mean, these are things that in downstate we would shake our head and say, oh my goodness. And Joe Heath, who is one of my colleagues upstate, who's the general counsel for Onondaga Nations, sits down with people at these lease meetings and they say, oh, that's not me. And he'll read through the script and they'll all say, it's me. They signed the leases the first day these landmen came in. And in a minute I'm going to explain to you what these leases said. Now we would say, who would do that? But they did. And these aren't silly people and uninformed people. These are educated people like us. I wanted to start with this, and Al talked about the chemicals, but we all like expensive water, don't we? I mean, I got the bottled water. This is the most expensive water you're ever going to buy, okay? And I want to thank Catherine Wachs for doing these great posters. With natural gas drilling, what you don't know can hurt you. okay? And as Al said, there's a threat. These are the chemicals, and I had wondered whether or not we could frack, Al, without these chemicals, but apparently we cannot. Al mentioned 2005. That was the year that Dick Cheney, former CEO of Halliburton, went to Congress and was able to get a number of environmental laws, Safe Drinking Water Act, Clean Water, and other environmental laws that were protecting us, amended to give the gas companies a free pass to put into their frac fluid these chemicals. We don't know what's in there. We can't test them. Okay? This is pretty remarkable. And what we're doing is we are paying the price for that. Now, is that a tax? It's probably our health care. But think about this. If we have health impacts from this, it's going to be because we don't know what the chemicals are. Now, there is a movement in the Congress right now to pass a law, the FRAC Act, that would reinstate this. It's not popular, okay? I think that when I think to myself about politicians who say, well, no new taxes, I would say to us, well, if somebody's going to support this, are they supporting taxes? I think we have to ask ourselves that question. And I think we have to ask the people who are representing us the tough questions. So this is the water, and it's downstate and it's upstate. So we've got these investor-driven gas companies. I took a look at the company disclosure statements, the 10Ks, which go with the annual reports. They're always very telling, and in fact, when you're dealing with the SEC, you sort of have to tell the truth. What's interesting about one of these, this is Chesapeake Energy. Oh, wrong glasses. Excuse me. Recognizing that better horizontal drilling and completion technologies, when applied to various new unconventional plays, would likely create a unique opportunity to capture decades' worth of drilling opportunities, we at Chesapeake Energy embarked on an aggressive lease acquisition program, which we have referred to as the gas shale land grab of 2006 through 2008, and the unconventional oil land grab of 2009 and 2010. We believe that the winner of these land grabs would enjoy competitive advantages for decades to come, as other companies would be locked out of the best new unconventional resource plays in the U.S. We believe that we have executed our land acquisition strategy with particular distinction. At December 31, 2010, we held approximately 13.2 million net acres of onshore leasehold in U.S. and have identified approximately 38,000 drilling opportunities on this leasehold. We believe this extensive backlog of drilling, that's an important phrase, extensive backlog of drilling, more than 10 years worth, at current drilling levels, provides unmistakable evidence of our future growth. These companies signed 5-year leases. They have a 10-year backlog. Okay. Now,
Can you,
yeah.
what does that mean, a 10-year backlog?
What they mean is they have amassed so much leasehold interest as the lessee under these leases that they can't even develop this for 10 years.
But the lease is only for 5 years?
Aha, that's right. What are we going to do? We're going to figure out a way to keep those leases going. Okay, so now, this is good for the investor. It's good. They can keep it off the market. They can keep the competition out. And for anybody here that's investing, that's a good thing for you. On the other hand, if you're a taxpayer, it may not be. I'll get to that in a minute. But if you're a homeowner, okay, you've got a lease, and that lease is encumbering your property. Now let me shift for a second. Everyone here owns homes, or grew up in a home, presumably. What I've done is I think about homes as a bundle of rights. That's what we learned in law school, right, Ken? We learned about, as a bundle of rights. You've got, if you break it down, think about the roof over your head, the very basics. You've got a roof over your head, you've got access to clean drinking water, you've got utilities, and you've got heat, the basics. You pay something for that. You pay something for the opportunity to build up and out. If you have an extra child, if you have an in-law come and move in, you might want to add on to the property. You have the right to lease your property. You have the right to mortgage your property. When it's time to move, you sell your property. That's another bundle of rights, and value goes to that. The third bundle of rights is what I call intangibles. It's your private place, it's your sanctuary, it's the place where you garden, it's the place where you listen to the birds, it's the place where you raise your children and you feel safe leaving them. All of these things are attributes of home ownership, and residential fracking, which is what I call it, and here it is, residential fracking takes these rights away, okay? Now, in 1998 and in 1999, and actually beginning in 1997, Andrew Cuomo was the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. I went back and just read some of his speeches to understand what was going on when he was dealing with housing. He himself built houses, and I think that he was, actually unique in that regard. He understands the value of a home. And during the Clinton administration, there were record homeowners in this country. He also revamped HUD, and there were record numbers of mortgages for people. They partnered with the mortgage bankers associations. They worked with the Association of Home Builders. And in his speeches to these August bodies, he said that home ownership is the cornerstone. It is the ideal of America. And I would agree with that, because that is what makes this country great. He said, our homeowners own their land, nobody else does. Residential fracking will change this. These documents are called leases, but they really are deeds with a homeowner guarantee. Let me give you some examples of what these leases do. They give gas companies the right to set up their drilling operations on the surface of somebody's property. So what that does is deprive the homeowner of an opportunity to build on their house because they don't know where the company is going to set up shop. They give the gas company the right to create easements going on indefinitely. These are easements for roads, utilities, telephones, underground easements, pipelines. There is no pot of money that is made available even after the lease surrenders. So if you need to repair this or maintain it, or if heaven forbid there is an accident, who's going to pay for it? It's not taken care of in the lease. Now, these leases reserve the right for the gas companies to store gas from any source whatsoever. That's kind of interesting. That means if you're getting gas from someplace else, you can use this person's property maybe as a warehouse. I'm not really sure exactly how that works, but they've reserved that right in the lease, okay? So, and I'm not even necessarily going to get into all the payment schemes because I know you're going to want to go home at some point, but a lot of this is for free. They will pay an upfront fee, okay, and then there are royalties which come later. That's typically 12.5%. And it's shared proportionately with the other people in the so-called spacing unit. So your 12.5% is net operating expenses, net, and it's proportionate to all the other people in your spacing unit. And here's the kicker. You don't get to look at the books and records of the company, okay? So they're going to tell you, okay, so that's how that one works. All right. There's one clause in the lease, though, that is particularly, I think, to me, as a real estate attorney, one that's really quite troublesome. And I think this is the one that's going to give the banking industry and DEC and others a real problem. There is a free right of assignment of these leases. Now, what that means is you can actually, and they do assign them, they swap them. So you sign a lease with somebody, and then you, meaning the landman, takes it, and it's, let's say, Chesapeake, or it's Fortuna, which is now Talisman. They can turn around and do a number of things. They can bring in investors, so they're not really selling the lease or assigning their lease, they're bringing in investors. Or they can literally assign the lease to somebody else as many times as they want and never tell the homeowner. Now, why does that matter? Well, if you assign the lease and never tell the homeowner has no idea that the document that gets assigned is consistent with the document that they signed initially, number one. Number two, you don't know who's coming onto your private property. Think about this. We've all done construction, whether it's a kitchen or a bathroom. These people are going to have drill sites on their private property, and they're not even vetting who's coming on their property to do the work. Now, this is obviously something that people really didn't think about when they were, and I'm sure if you're listening to me, you're thinking, wow, this is really something. people understand this now. The 5-year leases are coming due, and many of them desperately want to get out of a lease. Some of them want to stay in the leases. There are people who want to stay in and renegotiate. But you can see that if you can store gas on your property, indefinitely, there are chances for accidents, right? If you can have easements on your property indefinitely without a pot of money to pay, there can be accidents.
Does that mean past the term of the lease?
Yes, that means past the term of the lease indefinitely.
Gas storage as well?
Yes, gas storage as well, okay?
Well, what ends at the end of 5 years then?
Well, it's the lease term itself. Now, this is another very interesting twist about the leases. The leases typically go for 5 years, but if the well is capable of production, okay, this is a term, capable of production, then it can go on seemingly indefinitely until they're done fracking the well. Capable of production has a litany of different ways that it can be defined, including off-site preparation. That means perhaps, I don't know, you'd have to litigate it, sitting in a room. I mean, you could really, these are very broad terms that would enable somebody to keep these leases going on. The one that's being used now is force majeure, okay? Now we know this force majeure, an event beyond someone's control. Typically, it's a hailstorm, right? It's a flood, it's an act of God, it's fire, it's a plague. In this case, it's the DEC, because the government wanted to take time to look at the environmental impact. Now, the interesting thing is that when these leases were signed, nobody ever mentioned hydraulic fracturing, so why was that a force majeure event? But retroactively, it is. And so the companies are coming in and sending these so-called force majeure letters to the homeowners and saying, well, we really need to extend the lease term because it really didn't start. So there's a lot of litigation going on in the southern tier about this. But there's also another real interesting statute called, it's in General Obligations Law 15-304. I just want to digress for a second. You know when you have a space lease and it's up, it's up. It's over, you move out. And if you don't move out, you become what's called a month-to-month tenant, and you stay as a month-to-month tenant indefinitely. In fact, you could be a month-to-month tenant for years. No length of time as a month-to-month tenant is going to convert your tenancy into a period of years unless you sign a new lease. Different with gas drilling. Hey, when you sign a gas lease, the gas companies get a do-over under section 15-304. So the homeowner has to send the company a notice saying, your lease is up. And then the gas company says, I didn't really mean it. And they can file a paper and they can re-up their lease. Now, the one catch on that is that the lease has to be recorded. These leases, and this is where I think some homeowners may be okay, these leases are not being recorded. But this is very troublesome for these people because these people also want mortgages. And if you have given to a gas company the right to put easements on your property, store gas, what are the others, free right of assignment, you don't know who's coming in. Lenders are risk averse and gas leases are inherently risky business. So here we've got this colliding. Now,
May I ask why they wouldn't have recorded these leases?
I think there are a number of reasons. I think they may not record the leases because, first of all, there are dollar amounts in them, and the neighbors get very curious about what the neighbors are getting on their upfront payment. The other thing is you can learn who may have negotiated a better lease, right? So that then people. But I think this is actually imperative, and this is one of the things that I'm going to suggest to the DEC, that they really have to make this part of the permitting process. But let me backtrack a second. In this country, we've got, not in this country, in this state we have home rule. There's litigation going on in upstate New York dealing with this very issue. This is metaphorical, but this is totally incongruous. Residential fracking makes no sense to those of us who grew up in communities where you live and raise your family in one place, and you conduct heavy industrial activity in another place. And when I started to look at the laws, the reason it's so confounding is because they don't fit together. For example, a mortgage. A mortgage, again, prohibits the very activity that these gas leases allow. So the moment these people signed their gas leases, they violated their mortgages. Now, people didn't know that they were violating their mortgages, but they did. Now, we have a $6.7 trillion secondary mortgage market in this country. And we've got shale gas in 34 states. We're either poised to frack or we're fracking. We're fracking in a lot of places. We're in Texas, we're in Colorado, we're in Wyoming, we're in Dakota, we're in Alabama, we're in West Virginia, Colorado, Pennsylvania. I'm sure I missed a few, but we're in a lot of places. And it's possible, if you go on the internet, to find out that damage occurs. Statistically, anybody is going to say that the damage occurs, including Chesapeake. Let me read from their own words. Natural gas and oil operations are subject to many risks, including well blowouts, cratering and explosions, pipe failures, fires, abnormal pressure, uncontrollable flows of natural gas, oil, brine, or well fluids, or other environmental hazards. Our drilling operations involve risks of high pressure and from mechanical difficulties such as stuck pipes, collapsed casings, and separated cables. Some of these risks or hazards could materially and adversely affect our revenues and expenses by reducing or shutting in production from wells, or otherwise negatively impacting the protected economic performance of our prospects. And if any of these risks occur, we could sustain substantial losses as a result of injury or loss of life, severe damage or destruction of property, natural resources or equipment, pollution or other environmental damage, cleanup responsibilities, regulatory investigations, and administrative, civil, and criminal penalties and injunctions resulting in limitation or suspension of operations. This is the gas company's own words. Okay, so we know that these exist.
And in what context, like for investors or?
This is all to investors, but this is, what's important about this is that they have to make these disclosures so that investors understand that even if they're investing in the stock, maybe the dividends aren't going to be there, and this is the reason why they may not be there.
But
So
how could they say one thing in their PR and then say another thing?
What do you
I think
say?
that's the 64.
Like, don't they think that anybody could get their investor, I mean, like, it's like Orwellian.
How many people have even heard of this?
All right, let me just continue for a moment. We've got, now one of the important keys to this entire picture is the insurance. It's the insurance. These leases have no insurance clause in them. It's amazing. I mean, I looked, I couldn't find one. Now, when you got a space lease, you're a tenant, you have insurance, and you name your landlord as an insured, and that's the way it goes. And you know, when you have a mortgage, you have mortgage, and you have homeowners insurance, and you name your lender as an insured. These leases say nothing. Now, there is no such thing as homeowners insurance that insures for gas drilling. Okay, that doesn't happen, and that's for obvious reasons. But what's interesting to me is that the gas companies, in their own words, are underinsured. While we may maintain insurance against some but not all of the risks described above, our insurance may not be adequate to cover casualty losses or liabilities, and our insurance does not cover penalties or fines that may be assessed by a governmental authority. Also, in the future, we may not be able to obtain insurance at premium levels that justify its purchase. Here's another. We have experienced substantial increases in premiums, especially in areas affected by hurricanes and tropical storms. Insurers have imposed revised limits affecting how much the insurers will pay on actual storm claims, plus the cost to re-drill wells where substantial damage has been incurred. Insurers are also requiring us to retain larger deductibles and reducing the scope of what insurable, losses will include. Even with the increase in future insurance premiums, coverage will be reduced, requiring us to bear a greater potential risk if our natural gas and oil properties are damaged. We do not maintain any business interruption insurance. In addition, pollution and environmental risks generally are not fully insurable. If a significant accident or other event occurs that is not fully recoverable by insurance, it could have a material adverse effect on our financial condition and result of operations. Now, here's a number. This, I think, is interesting. Chesapeake Energy, and Chesapeake has the reason I'm using Chesapeake is because they're publicly traded, I could get this, but they also have thousands and thousands of leases upstate. But they are by no means the only company that is under lease upstate. They have approximately 45,800 gross and 22,600 net productive wells. Some of these are producing wells, some of these wells they have an interest in but they don't control. They actually operate and control 25,750 wells. So that's not by any means all of them, but let's just look at that number just because we know that they operate it and they control it. Okay, so they should have insurance for that. Chesapeake maintains a $75 million control of well policy that insures against certain sudden and accidental risks. That would probably be blowouts with drilling, completing, and operating our wells. There's no assurance that this insurance will be adequate to cover all losses or exposure to liability. Chesapeake also carries a $400 million comprehensive general liability umbrella policy and a $130 million pollution liability policy. Now, and then they go on to say that we believe that these policies are customary in the industry, which of course doesn't give me a great sense of security. When you consider that they have 25,750 wells and they have $400 million in general liability insurance, if you just did the straight math, it's $15,000 a well. Now we know that not every well is going to result in a casualty, but when you think about the flooding that went on, $400 million in upstate doesn't go very far. So the question then is, if we know, based on their own disclosure statements, that we have cratering, now radioactive material naturally occurs underground, and New York has a healthy share of it. This is an issue that comes up. I've written to the governor about it. I've written to DEC about it. This is an issue in the SGIS. It's something that is always pushed to the side. If you want to write about it, I would appreciate it, because once we bring up radioactivity, radium-226, you've heard about radon testing, right? Uranium. Now, New York has a law that prohibits the mining of uranium, and Al and I have talked about this. Maybe we're not mining for uranium, and there isn't an intent to mine for uranium, but if you were ever to look at the Environmental Conservation Law, Article 22, and read the legislative findings, you could just plunk in fracking and it would be the same thing. We worry about this waste migrating into people's water supply. Well, what if we don't intend to bring up the uranium, but we happen to because it's down there? This is not something we should overlook and push under the rug. Okay, this is important. In fact, in Texas, there's just been, they've uncovered that they have highly radioactive drinking water. This has been going on for a long time. And so, we may want to take the lead on this one and say, you know what, we want to head this off at the pass. We don't have a treatment plant to care for this waste, okay? It doesn't exist in the state of New York. Is there anything like this in Ohio for radioactive waste? People always say Ohio, but I'm not aware that there is any.
There's no treatment, there's no traditional water treatment for radioactive waste. Radioactive waste has to be treated like a solid medical waste and placed, whether it's liquid, solid, or even gas, and then placed in a highly hazardous landfill, the kind they use for medical waste, which is also often
But you
radioactive.
can't filter it, it's just you have to dispose of the filters.
No, you
No,
can't
no,
filter
you
it.
can't. There are filter mediums that will grab.
You're right, there are filter mediums, but not all filter mediums, and they're very expensive to operate, and they clog fairly rapidly because of the high toxicity of this stuff. But the truth of the matter is, most things can be treated if you're willing to spend enough money on them. Of course, if you're willing to spend enough money on them, you can buy windmills 10 times over.
Hi, did you want to? I'm sorry? Oh, okay, that's great. So we've got the cratering. The cratering can happen, and this is in their words. I'm not making this up. The cratering can happen from the intense drilling activity, radioactive material. Al explained the reason why well water contamination happens, and I believe that this happens with some regularity. The difficulty is that people are signing non-disclosure agreements. I think we found one case recently. the fun thing about the film is they keep talking about there are no reports of contaminated water, but they certainly exist. And the explosion is from the methane gas. So we've got these risks, and now we've got this secondary mortgage market. I did get in touch with the federal government this summer. I wrote to FHFA and Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, and I did get a response, and I did explain my research, and they did take it seriously. They did have a meeting. I have followed up with the general counsel at FHA. He has not returned my call. I think that now, this is now kind of out there. It's not that I haven't spoken to some people about this. I think once people start looking at things in the press, then it becomes less desirable to speak to somebody. I wanted to have an open dialogue. You know, I identified that I was an attorney with the League of Women Voters. I mean, really, this is an issue that impacts all of us, and I don't have all of the answers, but again, where the gas companies are going to be gaining, the housing industry is going to suffer. This really becomes, in my mind, a zero-sum game, because if we've got homes that are subject to mortgages, right, and maybe not everybody upstate has a mortgage, but 90% of the mortgages in this country are sold into the secondary mortgage market, okay? Now, so we've got the mortgages that were signed before the gas leases, and then we have the mortgages that are being signed after the gas leases, and they have some distinctions, but if we just look at the ones that are in the market already, you're sitting in these investment portfolios, and probably some of us have our retirement money that are tied up in home mortgages. Now, we bailed out with the secondary mortgage market, largely I think because maybe people's incomes were overinflated and maybe the value of the home was overinflated. But if we have well water contamination and we have explosion on any kind of even a semi-regular basis, the value of that collateral is going to be near zero. So not only are these people upstate going to be in terrible shape because they won't be able to sell their homes, and that's one of the issues that I'm trying to work with people upstate about, but we are going to have to absorb the loss. Someone's going to absorb the loss, and I don't know who it is, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be us, because unless we demand that the gas companies take responsibility. Now, I've just read to you about the insurance clauses, they're uninsured, then we're going to have to figure out, is there a pot of money? Wrote to the government, we asked them to set up an upfront fund. And Thomas DiNapoli did say that he was going to set up an upfront fund, and the industry is against it, and the governor is against it. So as of now, we're going to embark on drilling in upstate New York, and we have no safety net. So that's where we are. I think I'm going to leave it at that. There's more that maybe can come out in in questions. It's conceivable that we could drill in some places in remote locations where we're not behind people's homes, but I think what we really have to do from a financial point of view is try to level the imbalance of power now and put the responsibility back with the drilling company. Thank you.
Are you saying that they've already approved this drilling?
We are this close. I want people not to walk out of here with this false sense of security tonight, okay? I'm going to ask, okay, and now I'm going to give Ellen Weiniger. I've got letters that I've already written up based on some of my work. They're outside. You can sign the letter. We can mail them up to Albany. Ellen Weiniger has letters out, a million fracking letters. You can sign a letter, send it up to Albany, or you can mail it on your own. We've got information out there you can take with you. We can make it super easy for you. You can do it yourself. It's really a pain in the neck to write a letter. It really is.
Well, why would I write a letter where I've heard one side of this proposition antithetic to the gas drilling, and I haven't heard another side. There certainly is another side. ExxonMobil has invested billions in this.
Do you want to know what ExxonMobil has said in the XTO deal? If they unwind the Halliburton loophole, they get to put XTO back to that company. because it's gonna be too expensive for them to run the company.
I know, but this is a one-sided presentation.
And you know something, as I said in the beginning tonight, we're not obligated at the league tonight, at the end of all of this research, to be championing the gas company. What we're doing tonight is looking at the economics and looking at the water.
Now, I'm a reasonably fact-based person, but the truth of the matter is I've actually sat on a lot of panels with the industry representatives, and including the one you saw the brief squib of in Gasland. I will never forget the friend of mine who said, film doesn't make you look any thinner, but the look of disdain on your face for the shilling the other groups were doing, is worth the cost of admissions. If you hear the same thing from people time and time again, if they refuse to acknowledge simple facts, such as 1 out of every 10 leases in Pennsylvania has had a regulatory problem, and these are easy enough to check. You're free to listen to them if you want to. But the truth of the matter is, if you can find a representative of the gas industry, and the only people I've seen who are even remotely in that class is the Talisman Gas Company, which is based in Calgary and has to deal with a little better regulatory structure, you're welcome to that. I have 30 years of experience in public policy, from everything from land preservation to running water utility to restoring the Tisa River, and I have never seen, and I'm famous for my ability, and I'm very proud, I rarely blow this, but I'm very proud of it. The work I'm doing in California and other places is based on, to bring two sides together. I have never seen an industry that is so one-sided in its presentations. And I do not believe in false or formalistic fairness. I believe in real fairness. The truth of the matter is, as Elizabeth said earlier, if you want to get the other side of the argument as it is being made, and this is why I loved what Beth just did with the offering statements, because I long ago learned to read offering statements because people tend not to lie when they go to jail for it. And the contrast between the offering statements and what you see on TV, you don't have to bring someone from Exxon here, because they will say exactly the same thing they're saying in those millions of dollars of TV commercials they're putting out. Fine. I'm on your side in terms of fairness, but you also have to be brave enough to say these people are not playing with a full deck. And your definition of fairness has to reflect that fact. Now, you may disagree with that conclusion, but the truth of the matter is, and I'm sure Beth and many other people in this room have had to deal with, this is not an industry that is playing with a full deck. One of the reasons I do not feel obliged to call for a ban on gas fracking, which quite frankly I do because it gets me more of an audience, is that I know that the industry continues to behave the way it is. They will make a far better case for banning gas fracking than I ever will. So I'm on your side in theory, but in practice, if you can find somebody in the natural gas industry who will not just shill for this thing, I'd love to hear it.
Well, sir.
There is a question, does this affect zoning? There is litigation, Anschutz brought, about a week and a half ago, litigation against the town of Dryden. There are 15 municipalities in various ways that have zoned out, or I don't mean that in a sense, but they've either changed the zoning or they have changed a master plan. Now Dryden's interesting because they already had prohibited heavy industrial activity. So it was already prohibited before the leases were signed. They went back in to just be very clear to say, we want to be very clear that heavy industrial activity includes gas drilling. And now they've got this lawsuit on their hands.
So the individuals signed the lease in violation of the zoning.
No. Well, that's a good point. They signed a lease in violation of yeah, that might be the case. The question is whether or not these leases are going to be invalidated. That's a very good point that you raised. Here's the rub though. Anschutz took these leases, I don't know if anybody followed this, but this is a very wealthy man who's reclusive and lives in Colorado. He sold the company for $3 billion last year. They kept the name, which clues me in that they brought in investors. I don't think they assigned the leases, I think they just brought new people in, kept the name. I think, this is a $3 billion transaction. Those leases are the currency in trade. If those leases are terminated, he's lost his transaction, you see. So it's not in the company's best interest right now for these leases to go away. And I understand just this morning from people upstate that the companies are coming in and saying, okay, any deal you want, we'll renegotiate with you. So, we're making some progress here in the back, yes.
Has there been any attempts to take legal action for fraud, for instance, against any of the companies based on the way that the leases were, there wasn't full disclosure?
The question is, were there any action to take forward? Very good question. The Attorney General has been approached, and I think he'll be approached more than once on this issue. A question of whether or not there's a pattern in practice here that demonstrates.
Could be done privately also,
Pardon me?
It certainly could be done privately also.
Yeah, I'm not aware, I think that people have retained lawyers. The difficulty is, I don't know all of the lawyers, but this is something that's been discussed, no question about it. Ellen?
There was a comment earlier, Al, when you referred to, I think you were referring to the SGICE as regs. New York State does not have any regulations for hydraulic fracturing at this point in time, and never has. There is an SGICE out there, it's a document. SGICE stands for Supplemental Generic Environmental Impact Statement. It's an environmental review process. We're now in a public comment period for that review process. There was a public comment period that followed the first version. It ended in 2009. There was a rush to get this second statement out, which is a little improved, but hasn't really addressed many flaws, including no cumulative impacts, no health impacts of hydraulic fracturing. There's not one medical expert involved. There's the Department of Health from New York State has not been involved. But having said that, the public comment period ends the beginning of December, and then the process should continue in reviewing those public comments, and then a new revised version, and then finally the formulation of regulations. But what the state has done, what the DEC has done, is actually last week, in the midst of this environmental review process and public comment period, is thrown out some proposed regulations for hydraulic fracturing based on a flawed environmental impact statement that's sitting out there waiting for public comments. And so now the public is supposed to comment on those proposed regulations simultaneously with this review, this environmental impact statement. Very confusing, but you've got till December to do this, and then the permitting process starts. So essentially, just to get the flavor of what's happening is, there is no democratic process here, and I urge you, and I hope that all of you will be writing letters, will also participate in the public comment period as well, which is different. But separate from that, when you write those letters to Governor Cuomo, to express your concern, and you can personalize it, and there are many sample letters outside, and Beth also mentioned AmillionFrackingLetters.com, which is a website that gives you more information about this. It's really critical that you make copies of those letters. I don't care how simple that letter is, if it's 2 sentences long, make copies and send it to your legislators, your Board of Legislators here in Westchester County, your state legislators, to your congressional people, and to the president, and to the media, because it's a real dirty secret that's going up to Albany. All these thousands of letters that are being sent, and nobody knows about it, and your representatives don't know how you feel until you let them know. So I urge everyone to follow through.
I'm going to let Al say something and then Judy, but Al? Thank you,
There are a
Al.
lot of words like SGICE and regulations that are being tossed around here tonight, and it's easy to get lost in them. And I'm not going to, in the short time, try to fix that. What I am going to tell you is it should be obvious that this thing is so big, going back to what Beth said at the beginning. This is clearly the biggest environmental and economic issue in this state, in this decade, and probably the next. And it's being handled, as I think those comments illustrate, in a very half-baked way. And your local representatives are one of the best ways to get this slowed down. I have to also add that I personally believe that while we can have this all or nothing political debate, and I want to continue it, it's also very critical that the whole home rule principle, particularly those words zoning, that's a huge potential line of defense. There's no question, and even in Pennsylvania, the state Supreme Court upheld the right of local areas to zone this industrial use. There's no question that the local areas in the zoning laws of New York State have the right to zone out or to limit in areas that are very carefully defined where gas fracking will take place. In Calgary and British Columbia, they now require shale gas companies to pool infrastructure to minimize its impact on the landscape. So that there are things local authorities have the rights to do, and that's one of the things your local representatives should be supporting, because even if gas fracking is not going to come here, gas fracking support infrastructure could, as has happened across the river, in a town that begins with M, whose name unfortunately the gas
A
process.
mini-sink.
Mini-sink.
And you mean pipelines is what you mean?
I mean pipelines, processing systems, storage systems, all of that infrastructure. So that what we're being asked to do as a civic population is to treat this industry, which as Beth said, proposes to do up to 120,000 wells on the landscape of New York State, as if this was just another permit application of a kind farmers used to put in when they thought they had a little extra natural gas, you know, from an old oil well that they could capture and recollect. So we want the local representatives involved, we want zoning, we want this to be, if it's going to be done right. Don't get bogged down in the legal nomenclature. There's lots of us who will hack our way through that. What you have to say is what I hope you common sense realize, that with water supplies, farming, people's real estate property, this is a very hard industry to fit into its place. And the hardest thing I think we all have to realize is nobody feels the pain of other people unless it's unless it's come to them. That's why Gasland was such a brilliant accomplishment. But if you've been upstate and if you've talked to community groups and if you've seen the people who think they're literally fighting for their entire way of life, this makes the kind of arguments you hear on TV from an Exa, and this makes the kind of people who I have sat across the table from, and they've literally told me these things have never caused any harm. And if they've caused harm, it's purely anecdotal. You know, so how many anecdotes make a problem? Is always my question.
There's one point I want to make for those of us who have children who want to go to college upstate. It takes 1,150 truck trips. These are diesel-fueled tankers on upstate narrow roads. We're sending our kids upstate for the first time. Maybe they're behind four wheels. And these trucks are going back and forth and back and forth. It's something that if you're considering sending your children upstate New York, and we've got a wonderful college system, I would just urge you to look into it, and if you have concerns, also write to the universities there.
Unless you want to get rid of your kids.
Very funny.
What is the staff?
I have a question about what you said that, something to do with mobile, that if they had to if the Halliburton loophole was eliminated, so that in order to do their drilling, they had to prove that they were not going to impact the environment, it would become economically unfeasible
Correct.
for them to do this drilling.
Apparently, correct.
Well,
Well,
that's in the contract.
It seems to me that the thing to do is really, really focus on closing that loophole, right?
There's no question about it, and we've spoken to Senator Gillibrand, and you know, this has been in the Congress for quite a while. If you look at the makeup of the Congress right now, it's, what it is doing right now is eviscerating the EPA. Now, if people want to see our environmental laws come back, what we have to do is voice our concern for environmental laws that are gonna look out for people and not for the bottom line.
What I'm thinking is implicitly, if the dealing with the environmental impact of this drilling is so expensive, if they're not doing it, then we, in effect, taxpayers will have to do it
Yes.
to fix whatever they
That's
messed up,
exactly my point.
right?
And
So
yes.
they're shifting the cost
Yes, they are.
of all the environmental,
Absolutely.
And I
To
am
us.
shocked to learn the industry would do that.
Now, I want to make a point though, Judy, 1 second, is that, we're just asking them to disclose the chemicals. That's not good enough. I don't need for
No,
someone
no,
to
they
tell
can
me what poison they're giving me and then not be responsible for it. I frankly just don't want them to use the poison in the first place. Judy?
Yeah, I just wanted to underscore Ellen's point before, in the county, I'm a county legislator.
It's Judy Myers.
We have passed a resolution against fracking in New York State to New York State, to the governor. However, that was last year, and when you do write these letters, do copy all of the legislators, any of your legislators in the county and at the state level, because they're used to getting resolutions from boards and from other governing bodies that say, we don't like this, don't do it, please hear from us. But it's really, somebody once said, and it's really true, it's the weight of paper that comes up. They weigh this stuff literally on scales.
So a physical letter is better than an email?
No, you can don't listen if you're an environmentalist, but you can always print the email out. No, you can keep a thumb drive of the emails any way you want to communicate, but it's very, very helpful.
Sure.
Yeah, I kept hearing, why is Cuomo silly enough, or what is Cuomo's gain out of this? Why is he being so deaf as to what this is? He obviously has a lot of people who want this not to happen. Why is he being so deaf? Where is the money, what's the mechanism?
You'll make a lot of money as a political consultant if you can figure out the answer to that question, because it's very logical, and there's lots of speculation. Everything from he made a deal with the state senate to get his budget through easy, and this was part of the price, to he thinks this will help him in economic development upstate, to he doesn't want to look too environmental, to he's got the wrong advisors. I don't think anyone knows. Basically, you just have to be guided by what his actions tell you.
Yes.
Don't you think the case is being made on the other side of the ledger, that the case that would come to Cuomo is that this is jobs
There's no
to a
question.
starved region. So I think that's one thing that he is conscious of, the whole need to produce jobs. And the second thing is that natural gas does not have the same polluting qualities as fossil fuels, so
Natural gas is a fossil fuel,
I
let's be
mean,
clear on
it
that.
doesn't produce the same carbon dioxide. Is that not right? I heard you say it wasn't, but when it burns.
When it burns, it's better than oil or coal, but if you add up all of the emissions, what's called total carbon accounting, then natural gas, particularly because of its methane leaks and the enormous amount of truck traffic associated with its production, doesn't come off all that well at all. There are many people who also look at the role forests play in sequestering carbon and saying we're leveling tens of thousands of acres of forest to create these well pads, and that needs to go into the carbon accounting too. But you're right in suggesting that there are many people, including some environmentalists, I'm short to say, that are thinking of this in one-dimensional terms. And I also think, the jobs thing has a surface appeal, and it's hard to refute it, but the truth of the matter is, public officials, and I was once one, have got to go out and look at these things for themselves. They just cannot take the reports to their advisors. They gotta see how this stuff sits in the land. That's a very sad story.
But
What's
I just
happening in
think
Pennsylvania though what's happening in Pennsylvania is the people at the DEP are
Right.
being hired away. What's happening is there's a transfer of jobs. It's not necessarily a creation. If we look at what's going on in other states, for example, The truck drivers that drive the dairy trucks get paid more money if they drive the diesel fueled trucks, so that they transfer that over. We are bringing in jobs from other states. There may be some gain, but even Penn State has done studies to show that the net gain in jobs is not, frankly, what we think it's going to be. And then there's Susan Christopherson and Jeanette Barth, who you may want to read, who look at the boom-bust nature of this, and that the economics of towns after this is over is actually worse off. So, you know, there's
My
very-
only point is that I think that to make your case
Yes.
the strongest possible, it is good to acknowledge what the opposition is saying, and then
I agree with you.
counter
Well,
that
the point
with
is too,
other.
if we're looking at jobs, we're not looking at expenses. This is a very expensive way to extract gas, extremely expensive. You know, so, and the infrastructure costs are huge, and the municipalities upstate are not gonna start with a pot of money. So they're gonna start having to essentially tax their residents. Yes, Susanna?
The industry overinflates the amount of jobs that this industry creates. In fact, the technical jobs that pays something on the drill site, they're all imported from those headquartered states of Oklahoma and Texas. Please, I'd like to just mention that there is a movement rising up in the state of people who feel that this ruinous procedure of extreme energy extraction should be criminalized, that it should be outlawed. And the group is calling itself Frack Busters of New York and will soon announce itself. It has to pass a law to make it criminal, which of course has zero chance in the New York State Legislature as of now. It requires a mass movement, but to persuade Cuomo is going to require a greater movement than what we've got going now. And I just want to echo the thought that not a letter just to Cuomo should be sent, but copied to every other official in the state. Our letters are being ignored.
Sir?
Couple of quickies. Our two local legislators, both are keeping their hands free on this. They claim this is an executive problem, not a legislative problem. And second, I do have to take issue with you. I can't believe the people upstate are as smart as you gave them credit for being. Nobody signs a lease without taking it to an attorney. I mean, you don't sign a mortgage without taking it to your
I can't respond to that
attorney.
because I've been in touch with these folks. Do you practice law?
No, I do
Okay,
not.
let me just tell you, this is the most bizarre document, one of the most bizarre documents I've ever seen, and I've been practicing for 28 years. People did take these leases to lawyers. They didn't really understand what they were looking at. They didn't have a full set of facts, in fairness to the people upstate. When I started to look at these leases, and this is the truth, I cried. I have cried a lot through all of this. This is really difficult because I can see what's happening here, and you know, if you don't really get the financing and all of this, it takes a fair amount of practice to get this. Maybe you took it to a general, you know, trust and estates lawyer or somebody who closed your house. I'm telling you, I can show you this lease, it was not obvious. And it is true that some people did take it to their lawyers and many people frankly did not. The fact of the matter is, this is where we are. You know, for better or worse, this is where we are.
I know, but it
Can I
does
offer a
impact
point of
sympathy.
information on this?
Well,
Just by way-
actually, can I talk about the sympathy question just one second? Because I have talked to a bunch of people on this thing, and here's the line. And you've heard the elements of this. Well, I know this is gobbledygook, but this is just a standard contract. And I'm under deadlines to get these contracts signed, and in any event, I can assure you that we won't build on your hill. They come in and build on the hill. We won't put a road through here. We won't impact this wetland, and you can always come back to us. So that it's a combination of misdirection and subtle interpretation. Of course, as Beth says, no one could believe that that's what they tell them. It's standard language, so why bother to go to a lawyer? I can give you the insurance on behalf of the gas companies because we really want your business, blah, blah, blah. Now, obviously, a smart person would not, go to a good lawyer anyway. But remember too, these are people who are seeing much of this as a bonanza. That, this is finally a chance to get ahead of life. I mean, the best argument I ever heard one person gave me for signing a lease was the same argument I actually heard when I did the watershed program. Thank God you're here and I can send my kids to the dentist. I've heard exactly that same line. It really kind of shook me when I heard it.
How much are they paying these people?
It varies. It could be a few dollars an acre to thousands of dollars an acre for holdouts, but then they don't necessarily get any payment until there's drilling. And no, these companies don't have to drill. In other words, they can just hold these leases off the market if they wish. And by the way, there is a free right of what's called rescission under these leases. I'm sure no one ever even looked at them. In other words, you could undo the lease if you wanted to. They're supposed to statutorily have it. I'm not sure they all contain it. But as Al said, and also these people remembered their granddaddy had a well. Nobody explained what hydraulic fracturing was, and they knew, all they thought they were going to have to do to change their monthly routine was to bring the check to the bank. They really didn't understand what they were doing. So, here we are, Jeff.
Also, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, and people have brought leases to me upstate. I've had friends who are quite intelligent, but, they don't have a lawyer like Beth, or a representative like Al. And some of them are in very small towns where the average practice is pretty pedestrian, it's, to say, listen, also neighbors have been pitted by this industry against neighbors. That's the worst part. I have a friend with 2 young kids, under 7. He's pitted against a couple in their 80s with an underwater mortgage, Sullivan, Delaware, and upstate counties. He said, what can I do? The whole block is on my back. Because they're saying, this is the bonanza, and I'm 85 anyway, what's going to happen? I'm quoting these people. And the industry sends people out, and they even, in some cases, have demographically selected the land people, or sometimes land women, to actually divide neighbors where they see blockages. And, again, if someone's bringing me a
They never
lease,
knew
it's a
what hit
problem.
them.